pleased that he would be making more off me, and frustrated because if I signed the divorce papers, I'd own everything acquired in the marriage, and my attorney would have a shining star on his record. By the end of the 6th month, I was sure I truly despised my job, to the point I was giving deep consideration to doing something else for a living. I'd stayed with the sales job thus far because I was making bucket loads of money, and I might need the financial buffer for future legal services and whatever else that required a lot of green thrown at it. With this in mind, I began to do a bit of day trading. I think everyone has heard horror stories about day trading, and all the hope that went into it at the beginning only to come out of it hopeless and destitute. I did it a little differently. I set aside only so much money that I was willing to lose. Yes, lose. Because no one can tell how the markets are going to react from day to day. So, I had to prepare for the worst. Thus, if I lost everything I was playing with, it wouldn't hurt me that much. I'd like to say that I made a killing right away, but the truth is, I lost more than I made. But I figured that was the learning curve, and after a few weeks, I was able to adjust my buying and selling to reap the greatest results. I wasn't going to get rich, but I was able to make a bit of profit, which I used to buy more of the market. I've never been a risk taker, but when Melissa left, many of the reasons I'd been so careful throughout much of my adult life literally went with her. In the last 6 months, I had also signed up for a karate course. A friend had suggested it when he learned that my wife had deserted the kids and me. And he was right. The martial arts training gave me physical and mental balance in my life. It helped me so much that I started going 6 days a week. I wasn't interested in becoming a black belt. I just liked the discipline and found the self-defense aspect satisfying. I altered my schedule and went to the gym in the morning and the karate class at night. I got in the best shape of my life. And if I couldn't sleep, I'd get out of bed and practice my self-defense moves for 15 or 20 minutes. That always calmed me down. One other thing I did was renew my interest in guns. I had been a paratrooper in the Army for 4 years. I learned how to shoot and always enjoyed it. Once I married Melissa, I got rid of my guns after the girls were born. Still, I enjoy target shooting, and I would go occasionally. When I did, I would rent a gun for the day. Now, if I wanted a gun of my own, there was no one to object. But this wasn't the real reason I purchased a firearm and got a concealed weapons permit. The reason came about 2 weeks after Melissa left. I came home from work one evening and started noticing little things out of place. Since Melissa's disappearing act, I had been running the house strictly for myself. Since I didn't have or want to spend a lot of time cleaning, I adopted the attitude of a place for everything and everything in its place. The first thing I noticed was the key rack in the kitchen. It was simply a board with hooks where I hung the keys. I always kept them in a certain order. I noticed that my spare car key and the one for the front door were reversed. At first, I didn't think anything of it. I could have messed up putting the keys back. However, then I noticed the liquor cabinet and the silverware drawer keys were also reversed. I hadn't used either of those keys since before Melissa left. But it wasn't just the keys that set the hair on the back of my head standing up. I found a book on the nightstand that I had been reading had been moved. Not only that, but the bookmarker wasn't sticking out as much as usual. That may sound strange to some, but my daughter Carla had made this bookmarker for me when she was in the 3rd grade. On the top of the thin piece of colored cardboard, it said, "I love Daddy." I always made sure that part of the bookmark was sticking up, so I could see it. That day, only half of my daughter's writing was visible. The more I looked, the more I found little things out of place. I couldn't help but feel that someone had searched my house and tried to hide the fact. Okay, I have to admit that I wasn't entirely sure the house had been searched, but it unnerved me enough to get the locks changed and have an alarm system and cameras installed. I bought the top of the line for everything. The company I used assured me that even government spooks couldn't breach my system. It was then that I started going to a shooting range again. I also took some NRA home protection courses. Yeah, I was getting a little paranoid. But after living with Melissa all those years, it was so strange being by myself. My mind was a mess anyway, and nothing made sense to me. Things just didn't add up, and I somehow felt that I was missing the big picture. Or, perhaps, I was just deluding myself because of my love for my wife. Then it hit me that I didn't even know whether I still loved my wife or not anymore. Love is a funny thing. If it isn't nurtured, it dies. Well, that was a subject for whenever I came face to face with Melissa. And then I asked myself why I didn't just accept the divorce and move on. The terms of the divorce were certainly one-sided in my favor. Perhaps it was just my male ego, wanting the last word. I pushed all those thoughts away as they did nothing to comfort me. I suppose I should admit that I wasn't always by myself. Once the word circulated in the office that I had separated from my wife, I became a person of interest to several of my female coworkers. And after I began my regimen at the gym and karate, that interest really took off. I was getting hit on by women from virtually every department in our company, and I did go out on multiple dates, but nothing clicked. I was still too messed up and consumed by finding Melissa. Usually, after one date with me, the women knew I wasn't ready to get into a serious relationship. I had to have that closure before I could move on and hopefully find someone else. I'd gone as far as I could with my search and it was still in limbo. Although I had 3 likely suspects, none of them exactly matched the criteria I'd applied. After thinking about it a while, I made a change up and attempted to determine where Melissa might have gone to meet with her lover. Since I had very little to go on, other than what Melissa had written, I had to accept her words as truth. My search took a new direction. Using a map, a phone book, and the internet, I found every mall, coffee shop, and other public place where 2 people could meet that was within a 30-minute radius of my house. I was taken aback by what I found. There were literally hundreds of those type of places. It was about the only time my resolve truly weakened. But then I thought, what the hell? What else was there to do? I'm no investigator, but it just made sense to simply ask around. Armed with the most recent photo of Melissa and a printout photo of each of the 3 suspects, downloaded from the internet, I started from closest to the furthest. Each day at lunch, I would leave the office and head out on my search. I didn't have but 1 to 2 hours to do this. I printed out directions to each place I was visiting to limit the amount of time spent looking for each location. I managed to do 3 places a day. I didn't bother trying on weekends as Melissa stayed with me at those times, and I didn't know if the same people who worked on the weekdays were working the weekends at the places I was visiting. I hit pay dirt at the beginning of the 3rd week. By the time I got lucky, I was getting good at asking my questions and showing the photos. I'd assumed a bored air about it, buffered by a calm confidence. My attitude and approach were a huge difference between my first day and the day I found someone who admitted to seeing Melissa. In the beginning, I'd been unsure and somewhat nervous. I'd never done this before. Although it wasn't unlike doing a cold call in sales, the underlying current of my purpose was surfacing and people were picking up on it. When that happened, they clammed up quick. As it happened, it was on Friday, and I was at a combination cafe and bar when one of the female servers took a look of Melissa's photo and did a double take. I could tell by her reaction she'd recognized my wife, but at first she wasn't open about it. With some gentle cajoling and after painting her palm green, she was talking away like an auctioneer. She told me what she knew, which was quite a lot. However, she didn't recognize any of the 3 men in the photos. Then, at the end of her tale, she mentioned another man she'd seen my wife with. One sporting a gray beard, wearing eyeglasses, salt and pepper hair cut neat and short. There was more to her description, but those were the main things that stuck out. The server's description didn't ring a bell with me, but she did verify she'd seen them together more than once. They'd been together several times. Actually, I was close to feeling elated as I left the cafe. I finally had a solid piece of information that would help me take it further. The rest of Friday, I was in such a chipper mood that at work I received a few positive comments from my coworkers. Even my clients seemed to benefit, and so did I, as I closed one of the more difficult deals that had plagued the company for 2 months. My boss was happy to say the least, promising me a substantial monthly bonus to express his appreciation. All in all, life was looking up. I know that might sound inane considering my marital situation and the circumstances surrounding it, but damn if I didn't feel good anyway. Using the female server's description, I used a decent graphics editing software program to create a sort of police composite of the man's face. The final result was of someone I'd never met before, but looked like he belonged in some university teaching the virtues of proper grammar. In a monotone, no doubt. Once again, I hit the web and using my drawing tried to match it to someone that fit my previous criteria, but there were no apparent matches. After a couple of weeks, I'd about giving up. I had taken the drawing to work so I could continue searching during my lunch hour. Then one day, a coworker, Arturo Mendoza, happened to stop by to fill me in on a new contract he was working on, asking some things about the differential profit and loss formula we used. He was talking away when he spotted the drawing sitting off to the side of some paperwork on my desk. "Hey, I know that guy," Arturo exclaimed, switching topics in mid-stride, pointing to the image. "What, you know this guy?" I asked nonplussed. "Sure. Well, the drawing isn't exact, but it's close enough. He's one of those charity contributors we hustle every year for that benefit for kids that our company sponsors." I was stunned, but quickly becoming excited at my good fortune for the presence of Arturo. As calmly as I could, I asked something that I thought was more relevant to the conversation that wasn't too blatant with my interest. "Really? Does he contribute a lot?" "Oh yeah, he gives a bundle. You'd have to ask. I think it's Linda Jasinski in Human Resources who handles that, if you want to know the exact figures." But yeah, he's always good to tap for a few dollars. Sounds like a nice guy. I replied non-committally. Yeah, guess he is. Damn, I can't recall his name. Arturo had a look of concentration as he tried to remember. Stop, Arturo. I swear you're going to have me doing it too, I said, chuckling. Do what? Trying to figure out the guy's name. I laughed. Arturo laughed along with me. Say, why do you have that drawing anyway? I had been thinking of how to explain that part when the question invariably came up, and I had a simple, foolproof answer. I saw it lying on the lobby floor this morning, near the elevators. I thought it was a flyer, and you know how the cleaning crews get around here when people leave trash on the floor, so I picked it up and forgot about it. Until you mentioned it. Arturo looked at me, nodding his head. Yeah, the cleaning crews can get huffy about that stuff, and I don't know why. After all, isn't that their job? To clean. I nodded sagely, wondering if Arturo had somehow caught on, despite my nonchalance. He switched back to his original reason for dropping by, but when we were done and he was about to walk out, he turned back to me and in a low voice said, I remember now. His name is Conrad Miller. Without another word or giving a sign, he knew I was more interested than I'd acted. He left. Yippee, I had a name. Effing A. They say it's the little things in life that are the makeup of our overall happiness or sadness, and this little thing, the man's name, had me feeling like I was blasting off and on my way to the moon. I thought about getting right on it at work, but Arturo's behavior had me thinking it was best I did any sleuthing in the privacy of my home. Yes, home. I don't know when it happened, but my house had become my home. As empty, as filled with pain, and as suffused with Melissa's memories as it was my home again. It didn't take me long that evening to find out about Mr. Conrad Miller. And yes, he did have a younger wife and 2 young children, but there was nothing mentioned about any long trip out of the States. If anything, the guy was a homebody. I then looked up his wife, Diane Lindgren, not Miller. Obviously, she kept her maiden name. There wasn't much on her. It would seem she liked keeping to the shadows, which when you're married to a billionaire isn't something that's easy to do. As for Conrad, the web was filled with his notables, accomplishments, and his wealth. He'd been one of those lucky.com billionaires of the 1990s, building websites, nurturing them until someone came along and threw a lot of money at them to sell. Now, he was well diversified, having holdings in just about everything, from airlines to amusement parks, to companies dealing with weapon research and just about everything else in between. I could now understand what Melissa had meant in her warning to me. But what would a guy like that, who could have any woman, be wanting with my wife? It didn't make sense. His own wife, Diane, was a gorgeous woman, at least based on the few blurred photos of her I'd seen on the web. Melissa was no slouch in the looks department. However, she wasn't in the same league as Conrad's wife. Something didn't make sense. Well, nothing made sense. My elation evaporated quicker than it came, leaving me feeling lost and utterly confused. What do I do now? I'd been thinking a millionaire, or even a multimillionaire, but a billionaire. How do you approach those kind of people? None of the company's clients were that wealthy, most being multimillionaires, which isn't anything to sneeze at, but billionaires were a different breed of animal. They had hard-case security personnel surrounding them 24/7 for pity's sake. Contacting Conrad's wife no longer seemed possible. Hell, what had Melissa gotten herself, and me, into? Feeling more dejected than I had since Melissa had left, I went to bed truly at a loss. The rest of the week was pretty much the same. The feeling of uncertainty stayed with me, and for some reason, apprehensiveness tended to come and go, almost as if my subconscious knew something and was trying to keep me from finding out. Shit, it was the story of my life. First my wife, and now my own subconscious. Internet may be filled with lies, but it is damn handy when you're looking up people. I quickly pulled up the web pages on Conrad and Diane. I have to say that I was mystified by what I found. Conrad was, indeed, very wealthy, but he was no hunk. He looked more like a bookworm college professor. On the other hand, Diane was a beauty. On looks alone, even though Melissa was attractive and beautiful to me, she wasn't in the same class. Still, Diane might have been a raging bitch who drove Conrad into my wife's arms. Still, I was not closer to knowing why. I spent weeks investigating Conrad Miller's business interests. I'm not a financial analyst, but Conrad's businesses were certainly diversified. About a third of his businesses were publicly traded, so it was easy to get information on them. However, 2/3 of his business interests were privately held, making it very difficult to get any helpful information. As for my day trading, I had set aside $10,000 to invest. After weeks of making a few dollars but losing more, I finally ran through the whole $10,000. Then I plowed another 20,000 in before I started to figure it out. It took a lot of research, but after blowing almost $40,000, I started to make some small profits. I kept at it, and suddenly, I was clearing $5,000 or $10,000 on a single trade. By the 6th month after my wife's abandonment, I decided to quit my job and concentrate on 2 things: day trading and finding my cheating wife. My boss and others tried to change my mind, but I simply told them that I no longer desired to continue working now that Melissa was gone. I had accumulated almost $2 million in assets from various sources, with the day trading providing about 40% of that amount. The rest was savings and the equity in the house, which had no mortgage. I also had another $400,000 in a 401k that I could tap if I needed. I'd have to pay penalties, but so what? After I learned who my wife's lover was, I realized that he wasn't a millionaire. He was, in fact, a billionaire. My chances of getting close to him were between slim and none. Also, he seemed to be constantly on the go. So, I decided to try to learn what I could about his wife, Diane. Once again, I turned to the internet. Unfortunately, there wasn't much as she lived a kind of reclusive life. There were rumors that they were estranged, which wasn't surprising. The few pictures couldn't hide her beauty, but weren't really all that good. But one thing I did learn was that Conrad had a big estate in Tuxedo, New York. And apparently, that's where his wife and children lived. Apparently, he rarely spent any time there. I learned all of this about the same time that I quit my job. Now nothing was tying me to one place. In fact, all I needed was my laptop, a few changes of clothes, and my new camera with several expensive lenses. With these things and a full tank of gas, I was free to roam. Of course, there were my daughters, Katie and Carla, but I didn't have to worry about them. Katie was married and living in another state. Carla was attending college out of state, but had decided to finish up her degree this summer. She wanted to start on her master's degree in the fall. I still kept in constant contact with both, and my girls were pillars of strength for me. Sadly, they had taken their mother's abandonment hard. Carla was especially bitter as she had been very close to her mother. At the beginning of this mess, Carla had basically inferred that her mom left because of something I had done. But after weeks of no contact from her mother, Carla's anger was redirected. And sadly, I didn't help the situation. When Carla would rant that her mother was dead to her, I didn't stop her. Somehow it made me feel good that Melissa had lost at least one of her daughters, if not both. Katie, after a couple of months, began her own rants about her mother. By then, I tried to put a stop to such talk, but I failed. Still, I understood. They felt as betrayed as I did. At this point, I must apologize. I realize that this story is all over the place. But you have to understand that my thinking during this process was all over the place. Divorce is indeed much like experiencing a death in the family, and I was going through the 5 stages of grief. In the beginning, I had denied that Melissa was really gone. Then came the anger and bargaining. So many nights, I'd lay in bed praying to God that if he brought Melissa back to me, I'd go to church every Sunday after that. Of course, the depression set in by the 3rd week, and I guess part of that was still with me. But I had yet to find acceptance of my situation. That, I figured, would only come with a face-to-face with Melissa. At the beginning of the 7th month, several things happened that got my mind really back in the hunt. First of all, I got a call from my attorney asking what I wanted to do about the divorce. It had been months since I'd last heard from him, and I just thought the divorce had gone through. That's not really accurate. The truth was that I had completely put the divorce out of my mind. It wasn't something I had control over. I had assumed that since I refused to sign, they'd just push the divorce through themselves. So, I was shocked to find out that the divorce hadn't been finalized. That was really strange. The following day, I got calls from Carla and Katie. They had both gotten a call from their mother. I spoke first to Carla, and she was a mess. It took a full 10 minutes to calm her down enough to tell me what had been said. Apparently, as soon as Carla realized who it was, she unloaded on her mother. Carla told Melissa that she hoped screwing her new boyfriend was worth it because her mother was dead to her as far as she was concerned. Carla was really brutal, telling her mother that she didn't want her at her graduation or her wedding. Carla was now engaged, and the coup de grace was that if Carla had any children, Melissa would never get to see them. According to Carla, Melissa began to sob uncontrollably, and then the phone was disconnected. About a half hour later, I got a call from Katie, who was almost as upset as her sister. However, Katie had had a more civilized conversation. At least she tried to learn what her mother had been up to and where she was. Melissa, of course, refused to tell her any details. Over the months, I had held nothing back from my girls, so they knew about Conrad Miller. Katie, being the more reasoned of my two daughters, tried to shock her mother into revealing more. Katie calmly told her mother that she knew her lover was Conrad Miller. According to Katie, her mother had gasped at that information and tried to deny it. But at that point, Katie lost patience with her mother, and my daughter told me as much of the conversation as she could remember. After telling Melissa about Conrad Miller, Katie refused to listen to any of her mother's denials. "Look, Mother, this conversation is pointless," Katie had snapped. "You obviously don't care about Carla and me, or you wouldn't have abandoned us. And what you did to Dad was downright mean and despicable." "Katie, honey, I'm so sorry," Melissa had interrupted. "I do love you and your sister, but I had to do this." "Really, Mom?" Katie had snarled. "You had to rip Dad's heart out and stomp it into the ground. Your lover was so important to you that you abandoned your own children. You might as well have cut your two daughters' hearts out by what you did. In your note to Dad, you said you would grant us the privilege of contacting you if we so choose. That is so messed up. And in case you haven't figured it out yet, we choose not to have anything to do with you." At that point, according to Katie, Melissa broke down weeping, and all she kept saying was, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I still love you all." Then the phone went dead. About 3 a.m. the next morning, my phone began to ring. I'm sure that you all can relate. When you're woken from a sound sleep at that ungodly hour, your heart is pumping 1,000,000 miles a minute, and your brain is totally scrambled. All you can think is that something awful has happened. I was terrified for my two girls. After 2 attempts, I finally grabbed the phone. "Hello. Mark, I'm so sorry. My two girls hate me." I was pretty sure this was Melissa, but I wanted confirmation of that. So I said, "Who is this?" The phone went dead. I immediately got the number that had just called me. I immediately called it back, but no one answered. Later that day, when I called that number again, I was told it was no longer in service. However, it did learn that the phone call had come from Tuxedo, New York. It appeared that Melissa was back in the United States and living with her lover in New York. But that didn't make any sense. I knew that Conrad had an estate there, but it was supposed to be the residence for his wife and children. Maybe his wife and children were away. Or perhaps now that Conrad was back in this country, he decided to visit his children. About a month ago, I had discovered that Diane Lindgren supposedly lived on the estate with her children. So, I had tried to contact her by phone, but that was an exercise in futility. I was politely told that the lady of the house would not be available to phone calls from people she didn't know. Realizing that I was dealing with super rich people, I decided that I would have to get in touch with Diane another way. The following day, I spent doing a series of trades. By 5, I had netted $27,000. About 11 o'clock that night, I realized that I was out of milk, so I decided to do a bit of grocery shopping. I had just finished and was heading back to my car when a man grabbed me from behind. He whispered in my ear, "You need to stop bothering Mr. Miller." All of the pent-up anger and bitterness exploded at that point. Using my self-defense training, I turned quickly, kicking my assailant in the side of the knee, and grabbed his wrist, twisting it hard behind his back. "Who the hell are you?" I demanded as I glanced down at the man now on his knees, grimacing in pain. He appeared to be in his 30s, obviously in good shape, but he couldn't move. I had him in a grip where I could shatter his wrist and elbow with a sudden twist. This guy didn't look like a mugger, or even a strong-arm kind of guy. Still, he had a professional look about him. "You're making a big mistake," the man said through gritted teeth. At that point, I felt the gun pressed up against my head. "Let him go," the voice commanded. But I didn't let him go. Instead, I turned to my sales training. This was a negotiation. "I think we've got a Mexican standoff here," I said quietly. "You can shoot me, but I'll still snap your friend's arm in 2 places. He'll be crippled for life. Not only that, but the people will hear the gunshot and come running. They might even catch you before you get away." The man seemed to hesitate, so I decided to bluff. Besides, I've got a hidden microphone on me. What we're saying right now is being transmitted to a recorder. You won't have time to find the recorder before the police do. And when they do, it will connect Conrad Miller to a murder. "Okay," the man finally said. "What do you propose we do?" "To begin with, you're going to take 2 steps back," I said, much calmer than I felt. "You can keep your gun trained on me. Once you've done that, I'll get your friend up off the ground, but he'll then be facing you and shielding me. If I understand your assignment for tonight, you were to warn me to stay away from Mr. Miller. Consider your threat as having been delivered. Then I want you to start walking away. When I feel safe, I'll release your friend." "Okay," the man agreed. "We were told to just warn you, but not to hurt you this time." "Good," I said. struggling to keep the relief out of my voice. I'm glad that we're all reasonable men here. Now step back 2 paces. I heard the man slide back. I slowly raised his friend up off the ground. The look of pure rage that filled his face told me that he was still dangerous. It was clear that the man felt totally humiliated. "Look, a-hole," I growled in his ear. "I can still cripple you. In fact, I can kill you before your friend can fire his gun. But we don't want things to get messy, do we?" I tightened my grip on the man and twisted a little further. I heard him gasp, and then he nodded his head. "Now you turn and start walking away," I said to the other man. Reluctantly, he did as I told him. When he was about 50 feet away, he turned around and looked at me. "You said you'd release him," the man challenged. "I will, just as soon as you are too far away to be a threat to me. After all, I'm not the a-hole who started this." The man turned and continued to walk away. When he was about 75 feet away, I released the man I was holding and gave him a push toward his friend. Instead of following his friend, the man I had been holding turned to face me. "You've been warned. Stay away from Mr. Miller." At that point, I pulled my 9mm pistol out and pointed it at his head. "You tell your boss. I couldn't give a rat's shit about him. If he wants to keep his dirty little secrets about stealing other men's wives, he better leave me alone." When my gun suddenly appeared, my assailant turned pale. I don't think he suspected I'd be armed. I thought about following the men but reasoned that I wouldn't be able to tail their vehicle without them knowing. Even if I did get a license plate number, it wouldn't be connected to Conrad. No, at that moment, I needed to think and plan. I had obviously kicked the hornet's nest, but I wasn't sure what I had done to cause this kind of reaction. So, I gathered up my groceries from the parking lot and headed home. I got the key from the board and opened the liquor cabinet. I don't drink much, but I definitely need one tonight. When my nerves settled, I sat down at the kitchen table and started to list the things I knew, hoping to come up with a plan. First of all, Conrad Miller was definitely the man Melissa had run off with, but the why still haunted me. Conrad's wife was gorgeous, and from everything I'd read, she was a kind and generous person. Why would a billionaire choose my wife over this beautiful woman? Maybe Diane really was a bitch beneath it all. Yet, if that was the case, the media certainly hadn't picked up on it. And we all know how the media loves to tear down celebrities. I finally surmised that what probably provoked Conrad was my daughter Katie's mention that we knew it was Conrad Miller that Melissa had run off with. That plus my phone call a month ago to Conrad's wife had probably irritated the billionaire. At some point, in my desperate efforts to understand why Melissa had left the girls and me, I wondered if she had been in witness protection. That would explain the sudden departure and leaving everything behind. But if that was the case, why wouldn't she take the girls with her even if she didn't want me? Surely, they would still be in danger. But after tonight, I abandoned that idea. Those men were not trained government agents. Federal marshals would never threaten people, or at least, I didn't think they would. But in any case, they had been sloppy and allowed me to incapacitate one of them. Even with almost 6 months of intensive martial arts training, I shouldn't have been able to do that. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I was that these men were in the employ of Conrad Miller. That led me to 2 questions. Why did Conrad want to keep me away from Melissa? And why did Melissa just disappear on me without sitting down and discussing what she planned to do? The why of it all just kept rattling around in my brain. Those questions got me to thinking about Melissa before we got together. She had been 26 when we got married. I knew that she had worked as a bookkeeper after finishing school. She'd lived with her parents for a while, and then had her own apartment for a few years before we married. Her parents had died in a house fire before we started dating. With the destruction of the family home, almost all of Melissa's mementos of her early life were lost. It struck me that I really didn't know very much about Melissa before we got together. Then there was the matter of Melissa's cell phone. She had insisted that her cell phone be separate from mine and the girls. Even though it would have been cheaper to use a family plan, she insisted on having her own plan and even had the bill sent directly to her. I never saw any of the statements, and I never found any copies of her phone bills in the house. Since her abandonment, cell phone arrangement had bothered me. About the time I learned of Conrad Miller and that the divorce hadn't gone through, I came up with an ingenious way of getting copies of Melissa's cell phone bills. I requested a meeting with Melissa's divorce lawyer under the guise of discussing the final divorce settlement. I told him that I was very skeptical about everything, and I wanted to see copies of all the paperwork before deciding. He agreed, and everything was put out on a conference table for me to review. I placed my briefcase in front of me with it open while I read through the documents. It was the general power of attorney that I most wanted to see. Melissa had given this to her attorney to finalize everything. As I reviewed the document, I snapped pictures of it with a small but high-definition camera. Once I had photographed it all, I told Melissa's attorney that I would think about what I wanted to do and get back to him. Back at home, I downloaded the pictures of the power of attorney to my computer. Using the software I'd bought online, I reformatted the document to make it look like a true copy. The only change I made was to name myself as having this power of attorney. I knew that my altered power of attorney wouldn't pass close muster. Still, I felt fairly confident that it would do the trick when I showed it to a clerk at one of the cell phone provider stores. However, they did hit me with one wrinkle that could have foiled my plan. They wanted Melissa's password. That threw me for a moment. Then I remembered that I had once seen Melissa punch her password into her computer. She hadn't been aware that I was behind her, and I decided not to bother her at that moment. It was just a combination of our daughter's birth dates. It was the only password of Melissa's that I knew, so I took a chance and used it. It turned out to be the correct one, and I got 2 pieces of information from my deception. First, I learned that the cell phone had been canceled shortly after Melissa left me. I also got the last year of statements for the phone before Melissa's departure. Back at home, I pored over the statements and eliminated most of the calls as being routine. But once a month, Melissa called a number in Nashville until about 4 months before she abandoned me. The call was made on the same day and same time each month. It wasn't odd that Melissa would call someone in Nashville. We lived only 20 miles from the city. What was odd was that she called on the same day and same time each month. But then the calls got more frequent in the months leading up to Melissa's disappearance. And the day before she left, there were 5 calls to this number. The last call was just before I came home on that fateful day. The realization that Melissa was phoning her lover all this time sent my anger level soaring upward. But then another thought brought it swiftly down. If Melissa had started her affair a few months before, why was she only making 1 call to him each month for 8 straight months prior to the supposed start of the affair? And why were these calls always on the same day of the month? And the sudden flurry of calls raised questions that I had no answers to. Could the affair have suddenly heated up in the last few months? Perhaps, but it still didn't make sense. I called the number, but as I expected, it had been disconnected. I had been so hopeful, but the phone bills had just been another dead end. It was getting so frustrating that I once again thought I should just sign the divorce papers and move on. But deep within me, I knew that I would never have any peace if I did that. I needed to know why. After my nighttime encounter in the parking lot, I realized that the only piece of information I hadn't fully examined was the estate in Tuxedo, New York. So, I packed up my car and made the 13-hour trip to New York. I only had the thinnest of plans, which was of great concern to me. As I drove, I tried to refine something that resembled a workable plan. I was not successful. I was also concerned because I had brought my gun, and New York didn't recognize my concealed carry permit. Isn't it funny that New York has some of the harshest gun control laws and still has one of the highest murder rates? When I arrived in Tuxedo, I checked into a motel. I wanted to pay cash, but they insisted on a credit card. We compromised, and I let them run my credit card with the assurance that it wouldn't be processed unless necessary. I told them I was hiding from my wife until our divorce was final. They seemed sympathetic. Next, I scouted the estate. It was quite extensive, and only a small amount of the property was visible from the road. A high wall wound completely around to keep prying eyes from seeing anything. The front gate appeared to have men guarding it. They were fairly well hidden, but I could pick out 3 men just inside the closed gate with the telephoto lens on my camera. I took 3 or 4 pictures of each guard. When I scanned back through them, I was able to enlarge each picture and found something interesting. One of the guards was the man I had incapacitated that night in the parking lot. I was definitely in the right place. I just needed a way to either get inside or be able to see inside. As I was watching, 2 trucks arrived, and it sent a chill through me. They were moving trucks. If they were planning to bug out, I might never find them again. However, one of the guards came out and said something to the drivers. A few minutes later, the trucks left. However, I was sure that they'd be back. Now I was desperate. I had to get into that house. But I'm not a super secret agent with all kinds of special gadgets. I kept racking my brain, trying to come up with some way to get inside. Each idea that I brought up, I quickly discarded as ridiculous. The estate took up an entire block, so I made several slow passes around, making sure to bypass the front gate. This I did by cutting down side streets and then cutting back. On my 3rd circuit, I finally saw it. A large tree seemed to have a couple of limbs extended slightly over the wall in the northwest corner. It was a crazy idea, but it was all I had. So, I used my phone to locate the closest hardware store. Fortunately, there was one less than a half mile away. I raced to the store, bought a collapsible ladder and a length of rope. On the way back, I thanked God that I had decided to buy a Range Rover as my primary car. If I had used Melissa's Prius, I wouldn't have been able to get the ladder in the car. Once back, I stopped by the tree after assuring myself that no one was around. Then I unloaded the ladder and rope, hiding my purchases in the bushes. I parked my car less than a block away in case I had to make a quick getaway. Taking my camera and hanging it around my neck, I made my way back to the tree. Once again, I assured myself that no one was around before I opened the ladder up on the wall. With one last look around, I climbed up into the tree with the rope also looped over my neck. Then I kicked the ladder over. I didn't want nosy neighbors to report a strange ladder leaning against the wall. If I had to make an emergency exit, I would use the rope. The ironic thing about my situation right now was that I never would have been able to pull myself up into the tree 7 months ago. Now, after all of my exercise, it was no problem at all. I climbed further up into the tree until I had an unobstructed view of the entire backyard. It was large and beautifully landscaped. There was a patio with a very expensive-looking grill, outdoor patio furniture, and television set hung on the wall. However, the backyard's main feature was a large oval-shaped swimming pool with a waterfall and a slide. However, that wasn't what caught my attention. I couldn't believe it. Laying on a chaise lounge, reading a book, was Diane Lindgren. She looked even more beautiful in person. Then I saw the sliding glass door open, and someone came out of the house. It was a man, but he stayed in the shade of the porch for several minutes, so I couldn't make out who it was. Finally, he walked over to Diane and kissed her. I was totally shocked to see that it was Conrad Miller. This was totally screwed up. He steals my wife and is still carrying on with his wife. Then I heard a bit of a commotion from inside the house. 2 men carrying guns with silencers on them ordered the couple back into the house. I had no idea what was going on other than it was bad, really bad. I pulled my phone out and called 911. I told the operator to send the police because there had been a shooting. I didn't know there had been one, but I was pretty sure there would be. Besides, it would bring the police quicker. I had already tied off the rope, so I only had to throw it down. It only took me seconds to descend. Then it was an all-out sprint to the house, all the way across the lawn. I expected someone to step out and shoot me down, but no shots were fired. Once I was by the sliding glass door, I found it still open. As quietly as possible, I slipped in and crept to where I heard voices. Peeking into a spacious living room, I found 7 people. 4 of them I didn't know, but I instantly recognized the other 3. And my heart squeezed when I recognized one of them as Melissa. Melissa was sitting on a couch next to Diane with her husband on his wife's other side. "Please, Gino," Conrad pleaded. "Let the women go. I'm the one who took the money. I can get it all back for you and more." "It's no longer about the money," a short, heavy-set man with a nasty smile said. "It's about honor. You stole from us. That was bad enough. But that bitch got my brother Johnny sent to prison for 20 years. I was horrified when I saw Gino point his gun at my wife. Gino, she didn't do it. I did," Diane said defiantly. "I used her computer to send all the essential information to the government. She didn't have anything to do with it. But she complied all the information," Gino said. "Besides, it doesn't matter anyway. She knows too much, and I'm not leaving any loose ends." "Since you're going to kill us anyway," Conrad spoke up, "do you mind if I ask a few questions?" "Why not?" Gino said with a nasty smile. "I've got a few minutes. I sent one of my men to find out if my assumption is correct." "What assumption is that?" Conrad asked. Gino chuckled. "I have to admit that I was surprised when you and your bookkeeper showed up last night. We've been staking this place out for the last few weeks. I figured that eventually your wife would lead us to you. But then you came back here. There had to be a reason for you to risk coming back to this house. Otherwise, you would have just had your wife meet you someplace. There's something here that you wanted, and your wife couldn't get it for you." At that moment, another man entered the room. "You were right, Gino," he said with a smile. "I found a safe hidden in the floor." "I thought so." Gino's smile widened as he turned to Conrad. "Your problem was that you loved your wife too much. You tried to shield her from what you were doing. You should have trusted her with the combination. But then again, it wouldn't have mattered. We planned to follow her anyway, and she would have led us to you." Conrad looked over at his wife and sadly sighed. Then he looked back up at Gino. "But why did you go after Melissa? She was just a bookkeeper." "She was your personal bookkeeper," Gino corrected. "You always treated her more like a daughter than an employee. I figured if nothing else, she would know where all your money was and probably have a good idea how to access it. I also figured that she would know every property you owned, giving us places to search for you. I figured you'd eventually use one or more of those properties. But how did you learn that we had informed on your brother?" Diane asked. You were very clever how you fed the information to the government, Gino admitted. Even your husband didn't know that you were the informant at first. Still, it took years and a pile of money to get our hackers to find out the ultimate source of the information. I have to compliment you, Gino said with another chuckle. What are you calling yourself these days, Conrad Miller? That was pretty smart on your part. You and your wife both had plastic surgery and then re-emerged in plain sight as these new billionaires. Only the truth is that most of that wealth is a facade created by you to make you look wealthier than you are. That was a nice touch because I knew you hadn't stolen $1 billion. What did you get away with, 40 or 50 million? 78 million, Conrad corrected. That much, Gino nodded. I'm impressed, but you were always the smart one, Jacob, and that's why my brother brought you in. You took our illegal money and converted it into legitimate businesses. Your problem was that you were greedy. You skimmed so much money and hid it in businesses that we knew nothing about. But Johnny finally caught on to your scheme. He was about to eliminate you when your wife ratted him out to the feds. I must admit that it threw me off for a long time. It was only by accident that I stumbled onto your bookkeeper. I was going to grab her and her family. I was going to torture and kill, first her husband and then each girl until she gave you up. Once she spilled her guts, I planned to kill them all. But then she disappeared without a trace. Then I knew there was a mole in my organization. It didn't take long to figure out that it was Kelly and eliminate her. Kelly's dead? Conrad asked with shock and sadness on his face. Yes, but I didn't kill her. She jumped from a second-story window, trying to escape from us. Unfortunately, she died on impact, so we couldn't get any information out of her. Anyway, after your bookkeeper bolted, it didn't make any sense to grab her family without knowing where she was. So, we had taps put on their phones. It took many months, but that's how we discovered your real name and this location. If you knew we were here, why didn't you take us last night? Conrad asked. Gino shook his head. I guess you could say that I outsmarted myself. While we kept watch on this house, I figured you'd need new identifications. I found out who you were using and stopped the new IDs from being delivered. My plan was to replace the drivers in the moving vans with my men. But since you hadn't gotten your new identifications, you sent the moving vans away. That's when I decided to make my move anyway. And here we are. Enough talk. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. I need the combination to the safe. If you don't give it to me, I'll kill your bookkeeper first, then your wife, and finally, you. Worst case, I'll just cut open the safe. As I stood hiding just out of sight, it all made sense now. But what to do about it? In a flash of insight, I knew I only had one option. Gino, I used to think that there couldn't be a lower piece of shit than your brother, Conrad said with a snarl, but you proved me wrong. I'll take that as a compliment, Gino said with a laugh. But don't worry, I'll pass your regards on to Johnny. Now it's time to finish this. All the months of anger, depression, hopelessness faded away. I was still scared shitless, but I knew I had to act. I quickly ran all the instructions on firearms I'd received. Then I looked down at my Ruger to make sure the safety was off. Finally, I took aim at Gino. My instructor had taught me to take out the most immediate threat first, and then work your way through the rest. I knew that I would only have a few seconds to get off my shots, so I had to make each one count. Taking a small breath, I squeezed the trigger. I hit Gino in the middle of the back. He fell forward. Then I shot the man with his gun trained on Melissa, and he went down. I got off another shot, which hit the third man before they began returning fire. One of their bullets caught me on my left side, but I refused to stop shooting. Finally, the fourth and fifth man went down, but I'd been hit again. I felt the bullet slam into my left shoulder. At some point, one of their bullets must have creased my forehead because blood was running down my face. I stood there staring at Melissa, but I couldn't say anything. Her eyes were as wide as saucers, and she started toward me. I remember hearing the wail of police cars before everything went dark. When I woke up, I knew I was in a hospital, and I remembered everything that had happened. It was dark out, and my room was filled with just me and a bunch of medical equipment. I also realized that I was handcuffed to the bed. I was in pain, so I pushed the button for a nurse. To my surprise, Melissa came bustling into the room along with a policeman. "Mark," she said in a panicked voice, "are you all right?" "I just hurt," I said weakly. I was hoping someone could give me something for the pain. A nurse appeared seconds later with a syringe. She reached up to and pumped the pain medication into it. The pain began to subside. Melissa moved to my side, and the policeman stood at the foot of my bed. "Oh, Mark," Melissa was crying now. "I'm so sorry for putting you through all this. I just didn't know what else to do. I knew what Johnny and Gino could do, and I was terrified of what they'd do to you and girls. I wanted desperately to protect you all. I was hoping that Conrad would figure out a way to get Gino and his people off us, but he was as scared as I was. He finally convinced me that the only way to protect you and the girls was for me to tell you that I'd found a lover and divorce you. I almost crumbled when I saw the hurt in your eyes that day. Melissa started to sob harder. I reached out and took her hand. You did it to protect the girls and me. And yes, it hurt a lot. I've spent months trying to figure out why you had abandoned us. I was sure that you were gone, but I needed to know why. And I'm sorry. Apparently, it was me that led Gino and his men to you and Conrad. No, it wasn't your fault, Mark, Melissa choked out between sobs. It was all my fault. I was so lonely and missed my family so much that I called each of you, even though Conrad had warned me not to. When I found out how much my girls hated me, I wanted to die. Even then, I couldn't tell any of you where I was or what was going on. Conrad was working feverishly to get us new identities and to find us a new place to hide. The moving trucks arrived, but we still didn't have our identification. I had resigned myself that I was probably going to get killed, but at least my family would be safe. The pain medication kicked in at that point. I had no idea how long I was out, but the sun was shining when my eyes finally opened. Melissa was asleep in the chair next to my bed, and she was holding my hand. My arm had a large bandage on it, and it ached some, but it was my side that hurt more. Still, the pain wasn't all that bad, so I decided to try to pull myself up in the bed. If you've ever spent any time in a hospital bed, then you know they are the most uncomfortable things. Besides, it wasn't easy trying to move while one of your hands handcuffed to the bed. My attempt to sit up brought Melissa up out of her chair with alarm on her face. What are you doing? I'm just trying to get comfortable, I answered with a weak smile. She fussed over me and finally got me into a more comfortable position. Then she smiled at me and kissed me on the lips. I was totally surprised and very pleased. I thought I'd never feel her lips on mine ever again. I do love you with all my heart, she whispered in my ear. Can you ever forgive me for what I did? Melissa, it must be obvious to you that I still love you, I answered. I will admit that there were times when everyone was telling me to forget you and move on, that I did think about signing the divorce papers. But after 22 years of marriage, I just couldn't do it without knowing why. I'll admit that I thought that you might have taken a lover, but none of it made sense to me. And until I could know for sure that you didn't love me anymore, I couldn't give up. Oh God, what did I ever do to deserve you? Melissa said, and started to cry again. When she calmed down again, I told her to take the key to my motel room. Melissa looked totally exhausted, so I told her to get a shower and some sleep. Reluctantly, she agreed. However, getting the policeman on duty to agree to let my wife have my motel key was another story. Finally, a call to his superior shook the key free. I then learned that the district attorney was trying to decide if I should be charged with having an illegal handgun. Talk about a bunch of bullshit. I had helped take down a major crime organization, and they were upset that I didn't have a New York concealed weapons permit. That's totally screwed up. When she left, I asked the nurse if she could get my cell phone out of my pants pocket. That was another discussion. Apparently, the police had taken my phone. They finally agreed to allow me to use the hospital phone, and fortunately, I knew both my girls' phone numbers by heart. I called both Katie and Carla, and I told them the whole story. I left the fact that I was in the hospital until last. That sent both of them over the edge. Over my protests, they both said they were coming to be with me. Both girls had been distraught when they learned what their mother had been going through. Both were extremely upset with the way they had treated Melissa. I told them not to beat themselves up because I would have said worse if I had gotten the chance. 10 hours later, Katie arrived at the hospital. She'd been able to catch a flight to LaGuardia Airport and rent a car. She was ashen when she came into my room. Melissa had gone to get a cup of coffee. "Oh, Daddy, are you going to be all right?" she asked as she hugged me gingerly. "The doctors say I'm going to be fine," I assured her. "In fact, they'll be discharging me tomorrow." By then, the DA had decided that they weren't going to charge me. However, we had to agree to make ourselves available, at our expense, if they needed either of us to testify. A few minutes later, Melissa came back into the room. I hadn't told her that the girls were coming. I don't know exactly why I didn't. I guess I was afraid that she might run away again because of what the girls had said to her. They stared at each other for a few long moments before Katie ran to her mother, and they hugged. All I heard was sobbing as they told each other how sorry they were. For hours later, Carla arrived, and the scene was repeated. Soon, the three women were clustered around my bed, fussing over me. Finally, the nurse came and got me up to walk around. My wife and 2 daughters refused to leave my side. At that point, tears were running down my face. It took a little over 6 months, but I had gone from the ruins of my marriage to a marriage that will be stronger and more loving than ever before. In the weeks following the shootout, I learned that Gino died at the scene, as did 2 of his men. The other 2 survived surgery and are now facing murder and kidnapping charges. They will likely spend the rest of their lives in jail. Gino's brother Johnny apparently was in on all the planning, so he was also indicted for murder. All 3 of Conrad's guards died. I never had the 15 minutes of fame, thank God. My name was not released to the media. Melissa's name was also not released. Even though Gino and Johnny would never see the outside of a prison, I was concerned about what sort of reach they might still have. The FBI assured me that their organization had been totally smashed. In fact, Conrad Miller and Diane Lindgren had turned state's evidence. They were exposing parts of that criminal organization the feds hadn't discovered yet. In the end, we were not called to testify. Still, the FBI is many things, and completely trusting them these days is very much in question. Therefore, I insisted that our names be redacted. I even got a court order to seal those records. Yes, I know that if the government wants to unseal them, they will find some way to do it. Hopefully, no one will be that interested. Conrad and Diane were sentenced to community service. Of course, that was contingent upon them turning over the wealth they had accumulated with illegal money. Much of that money was in bitcoins, and the passwords to get that currency was in the safe. Nevertheless, Conrad and Diane must have had some really damaging information to trade for such a light sentence. I also learned that their 2 children had been staying with a nanny in Florida. And one other thing that I found amusing was that once Conrad and Diane finished their community service, they left the United States. I'm guessing that they didn't turn over all of the money, and there was nothing the government could do because they had disappeared. We did receive a postcard about a year later from Spain. It simply said, "We're sorry for everything. Thank you." Having Melissa back home took some adjustment for both of us. I was still harboring lingering resentment for her abandonment. Logically, I understood why she did it, but I was still suffering from the wounds it had inflicted. At the same time, Melissa was suffering from night terrors. She would wake up screaming some nights. People can say what they want about counseling, but it worked for us. Coming home was a bit of a shock for Melissa. Our house had changed quite a bit while she was gone. All of the repairs that I had been putting off during our marriage had been taken care of. The house had been repainted a different color, and our bedroom was totally redone. Melissa had to get used to the fact that I no longer want to work anymore. Well, that's not exactly right. I now work from my study, making day trades. And since I make my own hours, I take impromptu vacations with Melissa. She loves that. Melissa was very impressed by how trim I looked and started going to the gym with me in the morning. However, she wasn't interested in karate. We don't go every day like I had been. Now we go to the gym 3 times a week, and I go to karate twice a week. Our sex life rekindled in earnest. I guess that both of us realized that we couldn't take anything for granted ever again. Carla is getting married in 3 months, and Melissa is deeply involved with the wedding planning. Katie is pregnant and already knows it's going to be a boy. Both girls call virtually every day to check on us. Carla moved in with us for the first few weeks I was home. Because I was still very tender, I slept in the guest room. Sometime during each night, I would hear my bedroom door open, and Carla would peer in. I know she was just checking on me. However, I was somewhat relieved when Carla finally went back to her apartment. I mean, I love that she was so concerned about me, but I really didn't need another wife. Melissa and I worry about each other too much as it is. And when we started sleeping together again, I'd wake up when I'd feel her reach out to touch me and make sure I was still there. I'm not ashamed to admit that I do the same thing. At the very beginning of all this, I desperately needed to know why my wife had left me. Now I know. She left me because she loved me. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.